One of the worst weeks in the history of Wall Street has thankfully just wrapped up. The Dow diving more than 350 points today, but it was down as a frame of reference by more than 1,000 before that late rally. It has lost 3,600 points since the markets opened Monday morning. That is a whopping 12%. It has been the worst week since the financial crisis back in 2008, and also one of the most brutal weeks in history. Now, to put a dollar figure on it, the S&P 500 lost more than $3.5 trillion in value over the past 5 days. That's more than the size of the economies of countries like the UK, France, India, for a frame of reference. But we're not just talking about stocks. The virus, it is changing the way that many companies do business. IBM, for example, encouraging employees in several countries to work now from home. It's restricting business travel to several areas, deciding not to even send people to, for example, a cybersecurity conference in San Francisco. Other huge companies like Facebook, Goldman Sachs, they're also restricting business travel and participation in conferences. And speaking of Goldman, the investment bank issued a report last night, and I want to read a portion of it for you. Quote, "If the coronavirus epidemic materially affects the U.S. economy, it may increase the likelihood of Democratic victory in the 2020 election." The report went on to say that the second quarter of an election year is a key predictor of presidential races. Goldman also saying that the spread of the virus could wipe out any potential growth in corporate profits for the entire year, and also potentially send us into a recession. Also, since the global economy is interconnected, now the problems, for example, in China are having a huge ripple effect here. The FDA, for example, is saying factory shutdowns already causing a shortage of one prescription drug here, and we could see many more of those down the road. Let's bring in our guest, Rick Unger, host of the nationally syndicated radio program, The Rick Unger Show. And Rick, this is maybe macroeconomics 101 here, but the president, figuratively and even literally with a wall, wants to basically put a cocoon around the United States and keep out the world. But as we've seen by this, even if not one more person gets infected in the United States, what happens in China, what happens in so many other nations, has a direct impact on us in a globalized economy. For folks that are just coming to that realization right now, I don't know if the president's there yet, it does matter what happens in other places, and you can't just keep the people out. It impacts our economy in huge ways.
Well, that's absolutely true, Richard. I mean, look, unless you're going to manufacture 100% of everything that we need here in the United States, then when this sort of thing happens, it's going to have a massive impact. The reality is, I don't think people realize, just take the clothes that you wear, 40% of all of the apparel that comes into this country comes from China. I think it's a larger amount when it comes to footwear. So just on things like that that are not essential to your life, but you got to buy clothes, you shut down the factories in China for a period of time, and it's going to have an impact. You are going to see empty shelves, particularly in stores like Walmart. And when those shelves get empty, the price of buying the available goods begins to go up. You know, the president can believe in this all he wants, that we can seal off the United States. The ship sailed on that a very long time ago.
And just as a frame of reference, speaking of ships, you talk to any of the ports in our major, across this country, a lot of our viewing areas certainly know this. The shipping coming from China with goods is ground to a halt, which is impacting not only goods not coming in here, but also impacting everything along that supply chain. Now, Mark Zandi, who you know from Moody's, he pegged this thing as a 40% chance that we go into a recession, and he said he might even be undercounting it. What will the factors be that'll tell you, Rick, that we're going to go there? Obviously, none of us want us to end up there, but what puts it from 40 to a tipping point that it becomes probable, not just possible?
Well, as you know, Mark he's an old friend of mine, and he's a very smart guy. Actually, though, Richard, I think what's going to have the biggest impact on a recession scenario is not as much going to be supply chain coming in from places like China. It's going to be the inability of our domestic businesses to sell out. China is going to be in a very, very difficult situation for quite some time to come now. It was a little shaky, as you know, to begin with. That means that American companies who do a lot of their business in China, in Asia, they're going to be looking at some very, very serious problems. You always see recession teeing off first in that retail segment of the economy. Well, as I talked about a moment ago, if we've got an empty shelf problem, then that is obviously going to impact on big box stores like Walmart, and it's going to impact on the people who work there. These are the things that can come together to form a recession. Whether or not that's going to happen, and I think Mark probably has pegged it just about right, I might put it 40 to 50%, is going to depend on how bad this gets here in America and how long it lasts.
You know, listen, the president certainly didn't create this, but what we've seen from the messaging, basically on the same stage that we all saw contradicting his own health experts, and then on top of that, blaming, I don't know why, but injecting the political of this. Let's bring in as to who he says was the responsibility for why we had the market sell-off this week.
I really think the stock market of something I know a lot about. I think it took a hit maybe for two reasons. I think they look at the people that you watched debating last night and they say if there's even a possibility that can happen. I think it really takes a hit because of that. And it certainly took a hit because of this.
Okay, obviously, one had nothing to do with the other. I went already.
Considering the biggest losses were 2 days before the debate, but
don't let facts get in the way of a good story, Rick. But my point is, this isn't just, you know, pass the buck here, and you can just see it's when, not if, Pence is going to be, you know, the fall guy for this. But anyway, it's also today, for example, he says, you know, I'm hoping for a miracle that this will just disappear talking about the virus. He's not letting the heads of the CDC or the NIH talk to the media as much anymore. Even leaving all the preparation and legitimate questions about the cuts to funding for the agencies critical for this, Wall Street and investors, they hate volatility, and they want the idea that at the end of the day, it's being taken seriously, there'll be transparency, and we have a plan. Denial and shutting and putting the fingers in the ears and hoping it goes away, that's not a recipe to calm the jitters on Wall Street.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Wall Street, the most critical mistake that the administration made, and I know I don't like this president, that's not a secret, but, you know, there are expectations of any government. The biggest mistake that I saw was when Larry Kudlow, who was the top economic advisor, went in front of the TV cameras and said, I don't think this supply chain thing is going to be that big of a problem. Well, investors heard that, Wall Street heard that, and they're going, what are you talking about? Of course it's a problem. And that says to them, the administration is willing to lie. And if I can't believe them on something as simple and as basic as that, how can I believe anything they say? That is what breeds concern. That is what makes people know, I'm not going to know how to assess risk. And that's what the stock market's all about, because I'm not going to be getting information of value from the White House. The second thing that I think tells you that this could be a real problem, you know, you talked about the vice president, you talked about how CDC, et cetera, are being told not to talk to the media. When I found out that an organization like the CDC needed to clear anything that they were going to say through the vice president's office, that said big problem. Because in any other administration, it would be the vice president who would clear what he wants to say through the CDC, because you want to make sure that you've got your medical facts right before you talk to the public. This is not being managed in the way that one would hope to see it managed. I can't tell you it's going to make a difference ultimately in how this all turns out, but it does not give me a warm, fuzzy feeling that I'm in very good hands.
Obviously, any country, any government can prepare, hopefully, the best they can, and then hope for the best as it relates to this. But there are limited tools that they can to mitigate the damage to the economy. And I just want to remind everybody, the president was trying to fire Powell for so long because he wanted, even in a boom economy, to cut interest rates to zero or even go negative. Yep. he has limited tools, does the Fed chair, that he can grease the economy because it's already so low. We were saying before it would have been fiscally prudent to actually increase interest rates potentially even a year ago, just a little bit, because there's so few, as I said, tools, in the toolkit to fight this thing.
Well, you know what, Richard? I think the problem is even a little bigger than that. In a normal economic slowdown, in recession coming, the Fed has tools, even if it is as skimpy as you correctly point out. Here's what I'd be more concerned about. This kind of an event, this kind of a surprise, and I think the last time we saw this type of an event, not saying that it's going to get anywhere nearly as bad, but back on 9/11, an unexpected shock to the system, the Fed is not really the place to go to resolve the problem. That is the biggest problem of the Fed being able to do something. Lowering interest rates is not going to solve a supply chain problem. So I don't think we can really look to the Fed to bail us out of wherever this is taking us, if it's taking us anywhere at all.
Well, we're going to find out, unfortunately, I think sooner than later. But Rick, always good context for us. I appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend for yourself.
My pleasure. You too.
All right, everybody, when we come back, we're going to pivot here to the 2020 race and whether or not any of these Democrats can actually beat Bernie Sanders at this point. With the South Carolina primary just tomorrow and Super Tuesday 3 days later, we have reached a pivotal point here in the primary process.